Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Decouple podcast, where we explore the science and technologies that can decouple human well-being from its ecological impacts, and the politics that can make decoupling possible. Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Leigh Phillips, a science writer and political journalist. Leigh's work has appeared in Nature, Science, The Guardian, and Jacobin, amongst many other outlets. His areas of specialization include climate change, energy systems, the Earth system, and microbiology. Leigh is also the author of two books, The People's Republic of Walmart and Austerity Ecology. Welcome back, Leigh.
Hi, how's it going? Good to be back.
It's going good, and we're trying something new today on Decouple, doing this video feed. We're going to get this up on YouTube, so that's pretty exciting. We were just both kind of dappering ourselves up here. But Leigh, for our audience, you were on episode 10 back in July of 2020. The podcast has come a long way. We're at episode 41 now. So some of our listeners may need a refresher. So give our listeners a little refresher. Tell them a little bit about yourself and what you're all about. You know, it's that Robert Bryce question of you're sitting down at the dinner party and there's a keener, someone who's like keen and interested, and you can talk about your childhood, you can talk anything. The floor is open, Leigh. Give us your personal side.
I'm a science journalist. I worked in Brussels covering the European Union for almost 10 years. You basically covered in the intro there. I guess if there's a sort of my unique selling point is that I also write a lot about the crossroads of science and society, and the politics of a lot of scientific issues. And I'm a lefty, and I write regularly. I write regularly for Jacobin on sort of scientific issues. Awesome. As well as other publications that,
I have to say, for the listeners, Leigh was a major inspiration for the podcast, and this whole idea of not just looking at the decoupling technologies, but the politics that can make it happen.
Yeah,
and that's a major question. And Leigh's book, The People's Republic of Walmart, I think really kind of dives into a potential vision of how we can achieve that. And also, we're talking Bill Gates today. We're talking about his new book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. And I'm sure some of these issues are going to come up. So Leigh, let's just get a gut reaction to the book. Scale of 1 to 10. What are you scoring it? Is it worth reading? You recommend it to the audience?
Yeah, I think it's a solid 7.5 out of 10. I liked it. This is strange as a socialist to say, like, I like what the billionaire wrote. Yeah. I don't know, I guess if there has to be a world of billionaires, and as usually we say things, the lefties say things like, the existence of billionaires is a policy failure, or even it's a structural failure. If there have to be billionaires, I think Bill Gates is probably my favorite of them, because he takes the problem of markets very seriously. And it's interesting you mentioned my second book that co-wrote with economist Michal Rosy, People's Republic of Walmart. It's about exactly this. It's about economic planning and the limitations of markets and the history of the economic calculation of it. What would you, out of 10, what would you give it?
6.7. But I would strongly endorse that people read it and maybe pirate it. That people read it. And I think what's interesting about Bill Gates is, he has taken this interest in some of the world's problems in terms of, certainly global health and now climate change. And he has access to the brightest minds, and he reads like, this guy really reads. Yes. You look at the book list and what he's cramming through, and he's reading really he reads all of Vaclav Smil's work on energy. So he's very, very well educated. And again, I think through his investments as well, he's able to really, there's tons of startups that he's involved with. He's an intelligent man. It's useful, I think, to get his perspective, as much as I agree. I think billionaires are, the existence of billionaires is a striking kind of condemnation of our political system. And certainly, there's a big arguments to be had about, kind of the NGOization of global health, I think is a big concern. And I think, Bill Gates is famous for the Microsoft kind of antitrust monopoly. And to a degree, I think he has to be careful about monopolizing, the discourse on public health and on climate as well. I think,
yeah. Eventually, at the moment, I still think, broadly speaking, his interventions with respect to realism around technological realism, and there are quibbles that I have, but certainly compared to the vast majority of what, say, environmentalists who would be pushing for a 100% renewable energy strategy or decentralization, local solar plus storage kind of solutionism. He's a breath of fresh air on that front. I think it's great that he's interviewed, and I would say, he makes a lot of sort of similar arguments around with respect to pandemics. A lot of the analysis he has with respect to pandemics, I think, is excellent with respect to the need for the build out of global pandemic monitoring, including clinics and just ready to go vaccine manufacturing capacity, and recognizing that if we do this, it will cost tens of billions of dollars and without much likelihood of profitability. So this simply has to be a government endeavor. So for all those reasons, I think that he's a unique. He's the only billionaire I know of who is very serious about the limitations of markets, and I think that's what I really, really appreciate about him, and that goes with climate change as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting. One of the things I really like about the book is sometimes it's hard to keep track of the climate change debates, of the IPCC science. And I feel like he it's not that he dumbs it down, but he makes it very understandable. In terms of that kind of a summary. And recently I've been having a lot of guests on who, let's just say they see climate change as, a problem, but perhaps not our most urgent one, that are, I don't know where to put it. I mean, I had a guest who kind of refused to even use the scale of 1 to 10 for, how much climate should affect our energy choices. But, like folks like Michael Schellenberger, Ted Nordhaus, where it's kind of like, climate's like diabetes. It's kind of a pragmatic incrementalist thing. And, it's like, it's not fashionable amongst eco-modernists or many eco-modernist thinkers. There's a real rejection of the alarmism and catastrophism, which, I share to the degree that those alarmist and catastrophist folks are not, recommending anything beyond, degrowth and, I think a real failed analysis of energy in terms of, 100% renewables, that kind of thing. But, I still personally maintain a huge concern about climate. I mean, there's this paradox of needing to deal with extreme poverty, which is by necessity going to involve a lot of fossil fuel use and an energy transition towards fossil fuels in the developing world, away from biomass and things like that. But, it has implications in the long term. And, what I think, like with many of my guests, what I found is, they'll seize on a single issue as a result of climate change and say, oh yeah, sea level rise, well, we can adapt to that. But the issue is that it's kind of multifactorial. There's so many things that play into each other. I mean, just from the perspective of heat stress, I mean, there were something like 10,000 people that died in Europe back in the early 2000s as a result of a heat impact. That's one stress, but stresses on agriculture. One thing I really liked that Gates talked about was, the impact of extreme weather events. Yes, deaths as a result have gone down by 100-fold. That's an incredible accomplishment and has to do with, development on the back of fossil fuels. But, was it Hurricane Maria set Puerto Rico back 20 years in terms of their infrastructure? And so, yes, we can continue to develop and hopefully, get greater and greater adaptation tools through innovation. But, if we have this anchor we're dragging behind ourselves of constantly having to rebuild our infrastructure from extreme weather events, that's an issue. And the list goes on: ocean acidification, impacts on seafood, conflict over, scarce resources, refugee flows. When taken collectively, I mean, for me, I'm alarmed. I'm very worried. And of course, we know that the more we do now, the greater impact we have. Like the investment of reducing emissions now versus in 20 years is huge. And maybe it's as a father, thinking a little more long-term, I maintain a very great degree of concern. And so, of course, I share the kind of eco-modernist vision of, okay, well, we need to use all the available tools. We need to, pursue genetic engineering for adaptation of crops. I'm obviously a huge fan of nuclear energy in terms of that fundamental transition from combustion to fission. I think that's absolutely essential. But yeah, I'm not sure that was one of the ways I appreciated the book. I think he really intelligently pulls it all together for this kind of bird's eye view of the problem of climate change.
Oh yeah, I would definitely say that I was looking at the beginning of the book to see, like, okay, so who's his ghostwriter, right. And there were ghostwriters for his two previous books, or co-writers, I suppose, but there doesn't seem to be any listing of a ghostwriter for this one. It seems like he did write this one himself, so that's really impressive. You're right. There's lots of passages where the bit that I remember quite striking was his explanation of the difference between power and energy.
Yeah, and
that's the frustration that I have in a lot of environmental reporting journalism, where a lot of journalists covering this beat don't really they use power in that sort of popular sense, that it's a synonym for energy. And he's very clear about what power is, that it's energy per unit of time, second, and does in a very clear way be alarmist or not alarmist. I would argue that we should be alarmist about what it's appropriate to be alarmist about. Mm-hmm. One of the things, certainly, in terms of an understanding of deep time, that makes climate change particularly frightening to me is the recognition that we're putting out greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide in particular, at a rate many, many times higher than the rates of production of greenhouse gases by generally internal Earth sort of processes, large igneous provinces during some of the greatest mass extinction events in the past of the Earth's history. And we know that these sort of massive burps out of the Earth of carbon dioxide have huge impact on biodiversity, and that's the thing that really freaks me out. And that's actually honestly, that's something sometimes that a lot of even the most alarmist environmental activists don't really talk about. They don't talk about the deep time. They will talk about sea level rise, or refugees, or heat stress, but it's that big sort of geological unknown that's the one that keeps me awake at night. But I'm not as worried about sea level rise. But that one, like, that's really fucking scary.
It's exactly that. It's all a question of time scale. And, IPCC tends to set their limits in terms of predictions at 2100, and fair to a degree in terms of the uncertainties of modeling as we go further. But almost certainly things will not just stabilize there and we won't have to worry about it at that point. And, if we're thinking, I really love Stuart Brand's sort of like long now, 10,000 year thinking, even like kind of more traditional, like 7 generations thinking, remains a major concern to me. And I think it's an interesting argument that, in previous times with these rapid transitions, I mean, it was still over 10,000, 100,000 years in terms of the Permian mass extinction and things like that, the rate of CO2 being put into the atmosphere. And in our case, it's 100 years maybe, or 200 years since the Industrial Revolution. And you know, obviously in the past, adaptation of life occurred, you know, due to that process of, you know, natural selection and evolution and genetic change, and certain organisms that reproduce very quickly could adapt, you know, and that's why life kind of boiled down to more simple life forms. And obviously humans are not limited in terms of our adaptation by simple processes of natural selection. We have culture and technology. We're a highly adaptive species. James Lovelock, he had a really poignant, I was going to say poignant point, but sure, we'll run with that, where he was talking about, you know, so if we disrupt natural sort of ecosystem support services, yes, we can probably adapt. And he kind of gave the example of like wetland filtration of water, for instance. And he's like, yes, we have the technological capacity to essentially make a dialysis machine, but that's going to be a major drag on us. And I mean, just, you know, as the metaphor was powerful for me, because I see patients on dialysis 3 days a week, 4 hours at a time. It's horrible, right? Like, you know, so yes, you know, I think
technically humans can, sorry, I was just going to say, think about a sort of environmental dialysis machine. Well, we have those. They're called submarines. When we go down deep into the ocean, we can do that. It's certainly a drag that we would want to live permanently in that way. Or even a more quotidian sort of example, it's certainly possible for humans to live in the middle of the desert. We can build buildings with air conditioning, but then it's really hard to get from building to building. It's a drag. You can't sit outside to have a nice picnic or anything like that. So there's a reason why there's a sort of area in the world where humans tend to congregate, and we don't tend to live in that. It's exactly the same thing. We might be able to adapt to a world of this 5 degrees warmer, but do we want that world?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
you're still there. You're just nodding, pensively.
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, personally, no, and I think that's, you know, I talked a lot about Wizards and Prophets, Charles Mann's concept of the archetypes, and I think eco-modernists tend to have more of a comfort with the idea of like a real transition away from, say, like pastoral scenes of traditional agriculture towards like a nuclear powered vertical farming or growing protein in vats, you know, like fixing carbon from the atmosphere and enzymatic processes. And, you know, I tend to say like, maybe we can like have a little bit of both. And I think we're going to need to shift towards these technological fixes just to like lessen our impact. And that whole idea of like decoupling versus harmonizing with nature, you know, Bill's a big fan of the Green Revolution, and I think is trying to bring some of those things to Africa. Certainly there's big critiques of the Green Revolution, and you know, I brushed a lot of them off until I talked to Charles Mann, and he was talking about how, you know, the Green Revolution dramatically increased yields, which also really increased the value of land and led to a lot of expropriation by people who, you know, rich people who, you know, who didn't really give a shit about this marginal land, but all of a sudden it can produce a lot of profit. And like, we have to acknowledge that there's you know, major enclosures.
Yeah, but that's not the green rev. But that's not the technology.
No, it's the
that's not the transfer. That's well, no, it's the relations of production in which that revolution happened.
Yeah.
One can imagine a socialist society that doesn't have where social relations are not based primarily on property and markets. That same technology introduced would not have that impact on those people in that way. So once again, it's this confusion between, you know, to use old Marxist jargon, this confusion between the relations of production, our social relations, and the forces of production, basically technology, and targeting the technological change, missing what actually is causing the problem.
Yeah, you know, there's other obviously impacts of the Green Revolution, like you know, a dramatic increase in fertilizer use, and not that that's bad, but you know, inefficient uses of fertilizer and eutrophication as a result, or much more irrigation and depletion of aquifers and things like that. And that's why I think it's very interesting. There's a great book called Food 5.0 that goes through sort of the 5 stages of agriculture that we've seen so far, like a muscle-powered agriculture, largely slave-powered to a large degree, or certainly with that included, moving to like mechanized agriculture, tractors, machinery, to chemical, with a lot of pesticides added into genetic engineering. And then this last phase that he talks about is precision agriculture, where you're using a lot of like, high-tech sensors to really minimize the use of all of those inputs. I mean, not necessarily genetic engineering, but the chemical inputs, and tilling of soil. And to me, I mean, if that can be brought to underdeveloped places, and you can sort of get the best of both worlds of, excellent technologies, minimization of the application of some of these potentially environmentally harmful inputs, and the right politics that, can be conducive to, good social relations, then, that's, but I think what you're getting at is, this unique focus on sort of critiquing the technology. It's basically depriving people of the right to choose and to, increase yields and increase, that.
Well, it's also, yes, absolutely. But it's also, there's a hint of Luddism within there that that imagines that, well, one, it's a misdirection from the source of the problem, which is market relations, not the technology. So, and secondly, it sort of imagines that there was some period prior to the development of these technologies that was good or better. And that isn't the case. And finally, I think there's a even more basic problem here, where there's an idea that we could have a society without any problems. Mm-hmm. That's not feasible. Whatever new technology we develop, and your example of the aquifer exhaustion there, we develop a new technology, there will be unforeseen consequences as a result of that. There will be new problems. Okay, so we solve those problems, but in the process of solving those problems, new problems will arise, and so on and so on and so forth. Yeah. The key is, if in the process of solving some problems, have we actually retreated, or overall, despite the new problems, are we better? Have we actually progressed?
And I mean, Norman Borlaug.
And I think sometimes there's.
Sorry, yeah, I mean, Norman Borlaug, who Gates, heaps a lot of praise on. I mean, he did save 1 billion lives, right? Like, that's
exactly.
He won a Nobel Prize for a reason. It's not that his legacy is completely simplistically positive, but I mean, that's pretty hard to ignore, right? Like, we've been living in a kind of post-famine age for the last 50, 60 years. But let's.
Bill Gates writes in the book about how he's built, how Borlaug is one of his great heroes. Yeah. I would agree. I think it was a heroic thing, what happened there.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's kind of get back into the book. I guess certainly we've been talking tangentially, but it's been directly related. Were you surprised at all? Like, another thing I liked was he was able to sort of do the math for us, 50 gigatons per year. And we need to get that to zero. The sources of emissions, were you surprised by that? I mean, electricity, 25%, agriculture, 24%, manufacturing, 21%, transport, only 14%, and buildings like heating and cooling, only 6%. That was a revelation for me.
It wasn't so much of a revelation for me, because I have over the years paid a lot of attention to greenhouse gas inventories that countries have to submit to the UNFCCC UN Framework Convention on Climate Change every year. And one of my frustrations with some of the green left has been, like, for example, within Jacobin magazine, there will be writers who constantly harp on about how we need to stuff, extra insulation, retrofit buildings. I'm not opposed to that, but that is one of your primary sort of targets for mitigation when in the United States, and certainly the emissions reductions, the gains from that would be relatively small compared to, say, something like cement or steel production. And I love Bill Gates's, his framing of these questions, these 5 questions to assess whether somebody's serious about climate change. And one of them is, okay, so what's your plan for cement? And that's been I've been thinking that myself whenever I come across these grand plans, these 100% renewable energy plans, degrowth, et cetera, and I never see any commentary about, well, what do we do about cement or steel, these industrial processes? And they're a huge part of our what we have to be doing. And the thing is, it doesn't fit into a very simple narrative of villainy.
Yeah.
The way that fossil fuel companies do. And so I think that's why it's ignored. Also, I think just in general, there's a friend of mine, Fred Stafford, who put it recently that, he's written a lot about nuclear for Jacobin as well. And he put it that it's easier to convince sort of technically minded STEM people of the limitations of markets than it is, and the need for economic planning, than it is to try to convince socialists and green lefties of the need for an understanding of technical questions.
Yeah.
They just aren't familiar with some of these issues.
Yeah. No, I mean, in terms of the cement issue, one of the figures Bill Gates states is this: we're building a new New York City every month for the next 40 years is what we estimate in terms of the amount of concrete being poured. And I can't remember the stat, but in the last 10 years, China's poured more concrete than the US has in the last 100 years. I mean, it's wild.
Yeah.
It's wild for sure.
And in terms of anybody concerned with social justice, one of our major demands is a massive build out of public housing to solve the enormous housing crisis across the Western world, right? Well, how do we do that without cement? Now, I actually said this on Twitter once, and some greenie responded, "Oh, have you never heard of log cabins?" And I immediately thought, well, hold on a sec. Just 5 minutes ago, weren't you complaining about deforestation? Can you imagine the amount of deforestation that would occur if we had this massive public housing built out and it was all log cabins? And the land footprint? It's just not joined up thinking here. Sorry.
I have a reflection, in terms of engaging with, that kind of an argument, or engaging with, the kind of extreme fundamentalist anti-nuclear folks. They suck up so much oxygen and so much of our attention. And, more recently in terms of my advocacy and activism, it's you just got to ignore these people. They're not rational or reasonable. And, trying to appease them, it's just a losing strategy. And we need to be talking to, I don't know whether to call it the mushy middle, people that are a bit undecided. We really need to tailor our arguments to that group, because, especially with nuclear, we're trying to satisfy these demands, which are just, and unfortunately, Bill Gates plays into this in terms of how he talks about nuclear. He's getting a lot of credit for, at least not being anti-nuclear, I would say, and his embrace of advanced nuclear. But nowhere in this book does he say that we have to save existing plants that are at risk of political closure, right? Which is, the US is going to lose 5 gigawatts this year. And I mean, I haven't got the calculation off my head in terms of, how many million tons of CO2 that is. Nowhere does he in this book talk about the contributions of existing nuclear to date. And he basically focuses on, this innovation thing, and that we need to make it safer. We need to deal with waste. We have it's the safest form of energy generation, apart from Chernobyl, which again, if you look at the World Health estimates, it's still quite low, max about 4,000 people, but proven less than 100. Fukushima 0, TMI 0. Or the waste issue. I mean, I've did an interview with someone recently about deep geologic repository, and the fuel is placed in a geologic formation, multiple layers of containment beyond that, steel, copper, etc. But where water moves a meter every 3 million years, and the only mechanism for that waste to get to the biosphere is essentially it's got to get through all those barriers, right? It's got to, dissolve a solid ceramic fuel pellet and carry away enough radioisotopes for that, then get through whatever the bentonite clay layer. But then it's got to move through that rock formation. And people's imaginations are volcanic geysers of nuclear fuel that are going to, waste that are spewing up through half a kilometer of overburden. And it's just ridiculous. And, it's the industry as well that are trying to appease this tiny minority who will never be appeased. And Bill Gates is hoping to appease them with, advanced nuclear with even better safety and, dealing with the waste. And it's just like, we're on this tight timeline, and developing this new technology that can consume waste or create waste that only lasts 300 years. That should not be our priority. We have lots of time to work on waste. Civilian nuclear waste has not not killed a single person in the history of civilian nuclear waste. Like, let's lay that aside. And I wish Bill had made those arguments, because we need someone really influential. We need an influencer, so that these arguments aren't coming from like, the pro-nuclear fringe. So that was very frustrating for me in terms of, I think a lot of people are giving him a lot of credit for putting nuclear on the agenda. He's recently said, like, absolutely attitudes to nuclear are going to and have to change, but, it wasn't enough for me. Maybe that's not surprising to my listeners.
Yeah. Gosh, I mean, I think there's so many good things in the book, but particularly, as I say, around the key role of government in industrial policy, technology policy, innovation. Maybe we can talk about that in a minute. But yeah, the crucial thing that he's missing there, absolutely, is that actually over here, we have this technology that is pretty damn good already. Not just for decarbonizing electricity, but actually also for developing clean fuels, desalination. It's the Swiss Army knife of energy technologies, in a way that nothing else is. And it seems like even many of the pro-nuclear people, or not many, but there's a certain number of people within the sort of pro-nuclear camp that are so they're bending over backwards to accept and conform to the existing green narrative about nuclear, and say, well, it's not quite as bad as that, and they're not really singing from the rooftops about how amazing it is. And I think part of it does come down to the fact that what you had just said a few minutes ago about, and I get caught up in this as well, is that we spend a lot of time focusing on these people who take up a lot of oxygen in the discourse. So it's one group of NGOs speaking to another group of NGOs and activists, rather than speaking to what you call the mushy middle, but I would just call it like ordinary working people, and particularly trade unions, who are not anywhere near as hung up on these issues. Work at the coalface, let's say, of nuclear and other energy services, and really get how nuclear can play a role in terms of a just transition for a lot of oil and gas and other fossil workers. And if we can focus our energies on getting them on board with a green nuclear deal, that has some other aspects as well, certainly, but that is where we should be focusing our energy, because also that's where the votes are. There are many, many more people in trade unions, and who are just simply in the working class outside of trade unions, than there are in, add all the NGOs, the green NGOs together.
Yeah, no, and I mean, in terms of my own advocacy, something that I did recently that I was, I don't know, I guess kind of proud of and wanted to share as an example, if there's other advocates out there maybe listening to this podcast, though, was, we got this open letter in support of nuclear for climate change signed by James Hansen and a bunch of other notables. And, it's very hard to get into the mainstream media. Unfortunately, they wouldn't pick it up as a story. Then the national newspapers, they wanted $15,000, to publish it kind of as an ad. And so what I ended up doing was looking at, because a lot of nuclear, some nuclear in Canada, but a lot of nuclear in the States is, they're based in small towns, and that media is much more open. And I've really felt like exactly what you're saying. We need to speak to that base, mobilize them, show them, like, break the stigma, show them that we appreciate, the zero carbon electricity, the lack of air pollution, the medical isotopes, whatever it may be. And kind of mobilize that group. And I think that's the first constituency that you win over. And, through publishing that letter and a kind of shout out, like, hey, thank you for what you do. You're at the forefront of, the climate, and in Canada's case, the COVID battle. I mean, producing enough cobalt-60 to sterilize 40% of the world's surgical instruments, 20 billion pieces of PPE. That's where I think we need to be putting our efforts, to start. I keep saying, let's get back to the book here. And I think this is all sort of growing off of the book. But yeah, and
well, it is. Well, it's because of course somebody like Bill Gates does not, and also NGOs, for all of the good that they do, and they do good work. Just because of their position within society, it's going to be easier for them to overlook this huge group of people who have enormous social weight and voting power. They're not going to be thinking about trade unions first and foremost. They're, you know, he's a business person. He's a billionaire, and the NGO staff, and I include myself in this sort of professional managerial class of people. We are somewhat cut off from the bulk of the working class. It's not surprising that I think about talking about. If we could marry what he says in here with solutions, innovation, how private market actors are actual technology is proven. If we can marry that amazing package of stuff with the defense of conventional nuclear and a focus on trade union mobilization, working class mobilization, in order to drive this change, I think that's a pretty good package for driving a radical and rapid clean transition that is just and hits all of the greenhouse gas inventory boxes.
You broke up for a second there, but we'll just sorry, listeners. This video thing's probably straining my bandwidth, but I think it's okay. We got most of what you were saying. Yeah, I mean, just to kind of, I guess, close up on the nuclear side of things. I mean, certainly, I like his critique that, you know, we need to focus not just on the kind of low-hanging fruit. I mean, electricity, again, was what, 25% of global emissions? That's maybe one of the easier things to fix. But cement, steel, but I mean, all of those things, you know, energy is the master resource. And he'll say sort of, yeah, we need, you know, we'll need clean energy to do that. Sometimes he'll slip and say renewable energy, but he'll often not name nuclear and just kind of talk about other energy innovations. I got to say, one of the things I really, really liked, especially as, you know, this guy's a software guru, was he was saying energy is not like software. There is no Moore's law for energy, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's not about fitting microprocessors on a chip. This is not something where you design a great software with no regulation, essentially, and where the, you know, copying and distribution is essentially free. Energy doesn't work that way. There's physics-based limits. There's the Shockley-Kaiser limit, the Betz limit on sort of how many photons you can turn into electrons, or, you know, in terms of wind potential, we're getting close to those. You know, fuel efficiency for Henry Ford's Model T, you know, 21 miles a gallon. Now we're 51 miles a gallon. That's gone up by a factor of 3, but we're not seeing, it's not going to be exponential. And there's so much magical thinking, I think, about energy. I was really happy to see him bust through that and, you know, talk about capital costs may go down as we get a little bit better, but each power plant's still a lot of concrete, a lot of steel. It's a lot of investment. So I got to say, I'll give Bill kudos on that for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, particularly with respect to batteries, I think that's again, we have a bit of sort of magical thinking within some parts of the green movement, certainly in the green left, where there isn't a familiarity with some of these technical aspects, and they just sort of think that, oh, well, you know, it will just happen. And again, Bill Gates does a very good job of walking the reader through what those challenges are with respect to these particular technologies, and why you're not going to see a similar replication as you have done with transistors. And I don't know what I would say about it. I guess I just wish more people would pay attention to that sort of stuff.
Yeah, my feeling on that is because there's kind of such a de facto rejection of nuclear, like what you're left with as like quote unquote scalable sources is wind, solar, something to deal with intermittency, that it's kind of painful for these folks to actually start looking critically at what is sort of the salvation, having rejected completely nuclear, that, you know, there's either like a cognitive dissonance that really impacts, like, you know, Bill McKibben's review of Gates' book was pretty hilarious, and, you know, his solution basically boiled
I
down
haven't
to
read that yet.
wind, solar, batteries,
What
getting cheaper. That's what we need to do.
Yeah.
We need to follow Mark. You know, I wish he'd listened to Mark Z. Jacobson, for God's sakes. You know, and, you know, all we need to do is just crush and build out renewables. And it's just,
well, Gates
yeah.
Gates has this really great anecdote that he's used in the past, but he brought up again in the book about Tokyo. You know, Tokyo as a city requiring, I think I might get the numbers wrong here because I'm trying to remember them rather than, I was just trying to find it, the passage, and I couldn't find it. So I think he says it's 23 gigawatts, and which is, you know, a massive amount of power. And, you know, every year Tokyo is battered by typhoons for just a few days. And so that's a moment when, imagine Tokyo was completely run on wind energy. In the typhoon, you've got to shut those wind turbines down. And if you're following the Mark C. Jacobson, Bill McKibben pathway of just, we have all these batteries to just, I mean, the sheer volume and cost of 23 gigawatts worth of batteries just for 3 days a year is completely irrational. Never, I mean, before we even get to the like, where are we going to put all those? What are the materials to produce those? What is the land footprint of that? How do we recycle the waste? In terms of costs, even in let's say a social necessity rather than profitability, and there's still sort of, and that just would be completely irrational for those 3 days a year. It's a brilliant anecdote that just destroys, even if you can have this quite rapid reduction in the cost of batteries, you still have. Here, let me turn my I can dryer beeping at me.
No, don't worry about it. I'm just improving my connection with the door open. Yeah, I think having my door open is going to improve the signal a little bit. I think it's on my end. Yeah, I mean, I think the Japan example is good. We don't have to look any further, though, than something that was in the news very recently, namely Texas, right? Where, you know, if we follow the McKibben prescription, we're doing wind solar. I mean, maybe a massive overbuild, but, you know, in terms of what did fill in the gap, a bunch of natural gas, you know, froze up. But if you look at the profile of the generating capacity, natural gas, you know, did scale up to keep the system from completely collapsing. And, you know, batteries are going to do that in you know,
that's a really
weather. You know, and, you know, nuclear trucked along. It did trip. We lost, you know, 25% of nuclear output. You know, everything was affected. But, you know, it's funny, like, even the people kind of trying to stand up for wind in that environment are like, well, it's you know, reliably unreliable. So there's nothing to fill that gap. Batteries are not going to fill that gap. Texas is down for what, a week? What's going to charge those batteries, right? Like it's
No, that's a really good point. That never mind this Tokyo example. Actually, we have a real world example of this with Texas. And that filled the gap being replaced by batteries. And I think wind turbines this problem, at the same time recognize that if Texas were entirely dependent on wind, the situation would have been much worse.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, Meredith Angwin does a great job of talking about that very dangerous combination of wind and gas, wind being unreliable and gas being just-in-time delivery, and they don't pair well in terms of reliability. In terms of like the last bit on the critique of McKibben's critique of Gates is, if you follow the Mark Z. Jacobson plan, we're adding tons of solar capacity. By the time we get to 2050 and we're up to 100% renewables, people have done the calculations. We'd be replacing 1.23 square kilometers of solar panels every year forever. Every day forever. And I did the math on that. That's close to 500 square kilometers of solar panels needing to be replaced per year, every year into the future. Right. So there's this concept of the durability, right? Like, I think an argument against nuclear as well. Listen, it's taking a while to build plants. We have 9 years, 10 years, 12 years, 2050. But it's not that we need to get to zero emissions, obviously the sooner the better, but that needs to be durable, right? If we have infrastructure that lasts 60, 80 years and has a tiny land footprint and tiny material footprint, I mean, I think, the argument sort of makes itself there. And in my opinion, I think, a critique of the book was that it was too gentle on renewables for my liking, too charitable. It fits in with the language you see in the media all the time of, we haven't yet solved the issue with intermittency with renewables. I mean, this is not solvable on a scalable sense, right? Yes, you could overbuild in a little locality or build enough batteries for a private, electrically gated microgrid, and maybe make some hydrogen as a demonstration project. But, there's that key challenge that has been issued of, okay, 100% renewables, take this city, you got to power this whole city. No fossil backup. Go for it. See how it goes. Like, would anyone sign on to that? Or, these companies, including, I'm not sure Microsoft, but Apple, who, we're going to go, 100% renewables. They've now said 100% clean energy, but it's, they're buying diesel generators,
Oh yeah.
Yeah, big time.
And stuff like that.
Well, let's shift gears and talk a little bit about, Bill's big on, the government, yes, needs to really, I think, quintuple its investment in energy R&D. I mean, across the sector. That's the history of the internet, for instance, of so many of our modern inventions that we take for granted had their basis in government research. But he's very happy, to, once they're proven, hand them over to the private sector to commercialize and deploy. What's your take on that?
So I think what he's doing here is a very simplified version of what Italian-American economist Mariana Mazzucato talks about within her book, The Entrepreneurial State. And it's a really, really crucial insight to understand that innovation doesn't really happen very often in the private sector. It happens primarily by government labs, university labs. And the reason for that is because if a new technology, new concept, a new bit of science comes along and hasn't been proven yet how to make that profitable, it's really difficult to get investors to support that technology. And so you really, really do need innovation policy, industrial policy, economic planning, use of procurement, government procurement, to be able to take that new technology, new concept through the valley of death through to commercialization. It's not just about government funding basic research. It's about government funding and supporting and de-risking the commercialization process. And I'm a big supporter of this. I think this is an excellent idea, and I wish that the left took innovation policy more seriously. We don't talk enough about this. I mean, it's fundamentally a social democratic concept. You have to describe this. You have to have a fundamental understanding of the limitations of markets, rather than the neoliberal concept of markets, which is, well, markets are superior at everything compared to, and government just needs to get out of the way. The challenge there is, what do we do, as you say, at the back end, or when once that has been done, does government then just get out of the way? I think what Bill Gates doesn't talk about, and what Mariana Mazzucato does talk about, is sort of innovative ways of government recouping its investment, just like a venture capitalist would. So, okay, the state is is de-risking this potential new technology. We may not be in the business of the state may not be in the business of manufacturing this particular commodity, although in some cases it might be. And then it's spin off into the private sector to let the private sector do that. It'll be in return for a cut of once they produce that. Once you do that, the state then is able, that's a new revenue stream for the state. What has happened up until this point is that the state has been the major locus of innovation in almost all sectors, and then it just basically gives these technologies away in the form of university spin-offs. Well, why should we be doing that? We should be the public sector, the state, the people, the taxpayers were the ones who took on the risk. We should get a reward for that. And that's something that he doesn't talk about there. And this comes into another sort of issue that I have a problem with. The book is that because that's an interesting way of increasing government revenues. And one of the crucial problems with Gates's perspective with respect to the importance of government, not just with respect to climate change, but also when he talks about pandemic monitoring systems and building of factories or whatever, this requires a level of government resources, either borrowing or taxation. And billionaires in the capitalist class inherently have a resistance to the increasing taxation and or borrowing that would have an impact on their wealth, on their capital. There isn't just this simple trick. And there was a very interesting sort of pop interview done with Bill Gates last year by Stephen Colbert, where Colbert actually does ask a sort of pointed question, and he says, it's lovely that you're talking about all these government funding of these programs, but are you willing to pay, say, the tax rate of in France, where briefly for a few years the top income tax rate was 70%? And Gates says, whoa, steady on here, that's going a bit too far. Well, if we look at the ability of governments to just even keep their international commitments under the Paris Agreement of mobilizing $100 billion US a year in climate finance for the developing world, just 100 billion.
Yeah,
it's not a huge. I mean, it's a substantial amount of money, but it isn't. They should be able to afford this, and because of neoliberal constraints on taxation, they are for the last 40 years, they are unwilling to increase taxation in order to be able to fund that. So they're not even being able to keep that level of commitment. Can you imagine the level of taxation or the resistance from corporations and the wealth of the billionaires if a government did try to implement what Bill Gates is calling for?
Yeah, it's interesting when I was looking at those 70% marginal tax rates, and corporate tax rates that were also very high. Apparently part of what that encouraged was actually, in terms of getting a tax write-off, it meant not just kind of giving shareholder dividend payouts, because you'd still be taxed high on that, but actually investment, hiring more workers, building more infrastructure, spending your money as a tax write-off on, improving the business, on expanding, providing more jobs, whatever, that was a way to spare taxes. And that was part of what that tax policy really encouraged. So it's interesting because I think people think, oh, that's going to be overly punitive of the corporation. But what we have right now, and again, I'm not an economist, I'm pretty terrible at this, but we have, a lot of finance that's just sitting there speculatively, not being invested, not being used. And, if there's ever a time that we need to do that, it's now.
Oh yeah, you could go back to the 1950s, and the Republican president of the United States, Eisenhower. You have a top tax bracket of, I think it was 95%. Don't quote me on the exact figure, but it's ridiculously high compared to what we have today. And you look at the discourse around that and why that was implemented. The idea wasn't some socialist punitive measure. It was precisely to drive innovation. It was like, if these corporations take that money and they deliver to shareholders, or owners instead of reinvesting it in the company.
Yeah,
you're missing out on an enormous way to expand economic growth, to drive innovation, to create jobs. That's why they were doing it, and quite the contrary to the neoliberal argument that high tax rates undermine innovation and undermine job growth. That's actually what they're supposed to be doing.
yeah.
The problem is why social democracy isn't sufficient here is we do need to ask, well, why did that happen in the first place? Why did we retreat from that set of policies that almost all Western governments in the post-war period adhered to for roughly between, say, about 1945 to 1975, maybe late 1970s, early 1980s in some cases. Why did that happen? It was because by the 1960s, full employment, high levels of taxation to deliver social spending, and to drive innovation, et cetera, was impinging upon profitability and increasing. Basically, there was a political resistance to that from the capitalist class, and demanded a breaking of working class power, demanding a breaking, a retreat from public social spending in order to restore that profitability. And complementary to that, we have sort of globalization and financialization of the economy. And what this has resulted in is that even if you did elect a new government that wanted to revert to a sort of more social democratic, classic, post-war set of policies, what the French call les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years, there would be immediate capital flight and economic sabotage on the part of people like Bill Gates to discipline that particular government.
Mm-hmm.
And within months, that government would have to retreat from those sort of policies. So we do have to begin to be talking about something much more globally oriented, some sort of global social democracy. How do we do that? That's a huge ask. And the left at the moment isn't sort of envisaging any of these questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
I remember reading about the South African experience emerging from apartheid, and they had, very ambitious plans to build a, very social democratic state, this kind of progressive taxation in order to fund, developing this underdeveloped part of society, right? And they were severely financially disciplined, and the rand was, dropped in value, like excruciating drop. And it was only when they committed to a bunch of IMF packages and austerity packages that their currency reemerged from that punishment. You could say Francois Mitterrand, the French socialist president, elected in 1981. And on a very broad platform of a return to expansive social spending, increasing workers' wages, that whole sort of post-war package, within months. And this is just the early 80s, before the high point of neoliberalism in the sort of 1990s. Within months, he had to retreat from that program. Yeah.
And that's the sort of program that would be required to deliver on what Bill Gates is calling for.
Yeah. So just following up on the adaptation side of things, on aid, I think one of the most powerful things I saw in the book was, he's talking about how, global, Western aid officials were saying, we used to fund vaccines, but now we need to make our aid budget climate sensitive. And, Bill Gates' response is, please don't take away vaccine money and put it into electric cars. Africa is responsible for only 2% of all global emissions. We need to fund adaptation, right? And it's just, that was an incredibly powerful sentence to me, and kudos to Bill Gates for making that statement.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I don't know what more I could add to that. I agree.
Yeah. All right, Leigh. I think we're just getting past an hour here. Cool. Do you have anything major to add? We've had a very wide-ranging conversation, but any other takeaways from the book?
I mean, I did really want to get across this idea about sort of that what I guess what I did like, we just criticized it quite substantively, but I mean, in many respects, it is a sort of social democratic text for innovation. I would love for lefties to read it. There have been a couple of well, I wouldn't even call them reviews, because clearly the authors of the articles haven't read the book, from some progressive writers that I otherwise admire, and their initial sticking point, or the initial sort of jumping up point is, oh, he's a billionaire. The best thing that he can do is not be a billionaire. That's the best thing he can do for climate change. It's like, well, yeah, I don't disagree with you, but come on. I mean, please do take the book very, very seriously with respect to innovation policy, with respect to being very serious about the bins within greenhouse gas inventories, which not enough people are. Oh, I guess I would also say, and I want to know what you thought about this, I kind of liked his concept of the green premiums.
Right.
What did you think about that?
I thought it's an interesting tool to understand, which sectors require more innovation. Definitely.
Yeah.
Some of the examples, it almost boils down to like an individual consumer choice, the way he frames the example, not in all examples of this, but, he's like, well, if you could pay an extra, dollar per gallon of fuel, or $2, you could drive on like, clean biofuels. And what that neglects is, the scalability of that. Like, yes, as an individual, you can do that. And he talks a lot about his offsets. He has a private jet fleet that he uses to get around the world. And well, I fund startups and I buy these offsets, and it's very kind of individualistic and consumeristic. And we know that that's not the solution to climate change on the scale that we're talking about. So it rubbed me a bit the wrong way. I mean, what is the scalability of advanced biofuels, and what are the relative impacts of that? And I think he's intelligent enough to criticize that, but some of the green premium stuff kind of rubbed me the wrong way from that sense.
I mean, to give him his due, I think he probably used those examples because they're ones that are easy for readers to grok.
Yeah.
To get their minds wrapped around. But it's just as true with respect to government procurement, and I think the thing that really was important there was saying, like, even if we get say a clean alternative to a dirty technology to be as cheap or even a little bit cheaper than what it costs, what the dirty technology costs, making it feasible for us in Western countries to be able to make that shift pretty straightforwardly. There are parts of the world where they can't even afford the dirty alternative yet. So the green premium concept allows us to see how much farther we actually need to get to make the green alternative radically cheaper than the dirty alternative. The example there I'm thinking of is fertilizer. In parts of South Africa, where they don't even, like, never mind them having a problem with the fact that fertilizer is this enormous producer of greenhouse gas, but both production and use of it is this great producer of greenhouse gases. They aren't even using it yet. Yeah, that's the greater challenge there. So I did think that the green premium concept was a very, very useful metric that I hadn't thought about before, and I think I'll be using that in the future. So long as you're right, so long as we don't sort of use it as a sort of more consumer individual choice sort of response to climate change.
Yeah, and I think really explore what it looks like to scale up, not just as like a little individual example of, and a lot of these technologies are in a nascent phase. And so, yes, to some degree, it makes sense to talk about them this way, but certainly, other ones you can look at what it would require to scale and what the limits are from that. I think that gets lost a little bit in the green premium. So, in closing, Leigh, if you could sit down with Bill Gates, you had 10 minutes with him, what would be, what you'd like to emphasize with him, or what would you like to change his thinking on slightly? If you had that opportunity. He consults a lot of world experts. He comes to you. What would you say in that time? And for him to maybe influence the broader public, because listen, this has got an influential guy. He's all over the media now. Yeah. Gates Notes is out there. He has dominated the global health discourse. I'm not saying he's going to dominate climate, but this is a splash. This book is a big deal.
I would try to get across to him the fundamental contradiction between what he wants to be doing in terms of government policy and government spending, and his unwillingness, and not merely personal unwillingness, but structural inability for his class, the owning class, to enable that sort of spending. That I would try to get across to him the fundamental contradiction of between government spending and capital flight. Yeah, I think he's sort of like 7/10 of the way there in terms of effectively a left-wing critique of markets and why markets are a problem. But he simply can't get the last 3/10 of the way there. I don't know if I would, but what would I try to convince him of? I wouldn't be able to convince him, because it isn't a matter of him being a good or bad person. It's a matter of his place in society.
Yeah.
He can't change. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for me, I think it would really be to try and influence him on his messaging about nuclear, to use his position, especially this elevated position he's got in the aftermath of this book, to talk about saving existing nuclear. And, and again, to prioritize the problem, which is to get to zero, not to solve the waste problem right now, or not to improve on safety margins, which are already, absolutely excellent. Let's say he wanted to back, an existing technology, like say the BWRX 300, if he wants to go kind of small modular and like work with the government on rolling that out. I mean, he's got billions, he could throw something at it. But I think he could pressure governments to, take out low interest loans to finance something like that and get it off its feet. In terms of, comparing the relative speed with which you can mobilize a sector within energy, I mean, nuclear is a slow beast to get moving, right? It's carries a massive payload in terms of the payoff of using it and in terms of carbon reductions, but it takes that coordinated government support to get it going in a way that like wind and solar are low hanging fruit, because they're, individual units are cheap to build. It's very conducive to our sort of private financing arrangements that we have at present. So, I don't know. I look at the Bezos fortune and the Gates fortune, and I'm like, man, they could get a few plants built and they could kickstart this. That would be pretty cool. But
yeah,
I'm dreaming. But I think just on the message.
I mean, I guess you and I have a common critique of some of the focus within the pro-nuclear community, particularly in the United States, to sort of only about advanced nuclear, and they're not talking enough about existing nuclear being this great, already proven technology. But what I would like flip that over, I do think we do need advanced nuclear as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, Canada is a really great example of this. Conventional nuclear is not going to be able to decarbonize remote extraction, but very small modular reactors will be able to do that. Yeah. So I would rather there be a conversation about right sizing the different types of nuclear rather than this, I think, completely not very useful battle between the defenders of conventional nuclear and the defenders of advanced nuclear. We need them both.
Yeah. It's just interesting the way that, innovation is supposed to save us lots of money, but like you look at designs like the APR, I think that's the American pressurized reactor, advanced pressurized reactor, APR 1000. And I mean, it's got a whole bunch of elements in it that are supposed to reduce costs. It's quite modular. There's a lot of factory built components, and yet it's, gone incredibly over budget. And, I think there's a really solid analysis there that innovation actually can make things a lot more expensive. And certainly that needs to come, but it needs to come out of a healthy sector that knows how to build massive infrastructure projects. So
I agree. I totally agree. I totally agree.
Yeah.
I totally agree.
All right. I mean,
but sorry, I was just going to say smart, broadly social democratic innovation policy would be able to put those two things together. Yeah. The challenge with a lot of the pro-advanced nuclear people in the United States is they're thoroughly captured by, or partially captured by, neoliberalism, in the sense that either there's those amongst them who are very sort of pro-market, other ones who recognized the limitations of markets, but have just basically given up on the possibility of having any sort of American social democratic innovation policy or infrastructure policy. And so this is the next best option. You'll hear lines like, well, yeah, it is absolutely true that the very fastest way to deeply decarbonize would be for us to embrace a France-style, state-driven, centralized build out of conventional nuclear. But that's not going to happen. So we have to go with advanced nuclear instead. It's not as good, but there's no alternative.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. One would hope that the experience in Texas with their energy only, hyper deregulated market that does not value reliability or having any reserve capacity will be a stinging lesson for that. But we'll see as the culture wars kind of, just dumb down that debate. One would hope. Leigh, I think we'll wrap up there. Very wide-ranging conversation. I think we touched on, most of the themes in the book. Certainly, again, I would recommend picking it up and reading it. It's an important contribution. Thanks so much for coming on, Leigh, to discuss it. It was a lot of fun.
All right. Yeah, I enjoyed it too.
All right, man. Over and out.
Take care.
If you enjoyed the podcast, please make sure to subscribe, like, and review us on your podcast platform of choice. Until next time, guys.